we're going to be looking at the Third Reich as a racial state. Of course, the Holocaust, the murder of the European Jews, the medical killing, Operation T4, and other race state measures that the Third Reich undertakes is one of the phenomenon that distinguishes the Third Reich, this short 12-year regime that essentially changes the world. And so I guess we have to kind of go back to the early beginning, back to where I began the course from, at the beginning of the two millennia and earlier. Anti-Semitism is, of course, one of kind of the oldest phenomenon in Western civilization. The Nazis did not invent it, but they certainly adopted it, and they introduced kind of a new form of anti-Semitism that distinguished it from others. So I'll try to give you, as best as I can, a kind of 3,000-year global introduction to anti-Semitism, and then just look at what Nazi Germany actually did with it. At the heart of the term anti-Semitism is perhaps what is known as the Hamitic myth. It emerges out of a passage in the Old Testament, Genesis 9, chapter or verse 18. The story essentially is Noah's sons. He has three of them: Japheth, Shem or Sem, and Ham. Thus, the Hamitic myth, and it's an odd biblical parable in the Old Testament. Noah drinks a little bit too much wine, and he passes out in his tent, and as Noah is thrashing in his sleep, he kicks off his bed covers and is exposed naked, and so one of his sons, the son Ham, sees his father and calls his two brothers over, Japheth and Sem, and says, "Look, isn't this funny? Dad is naked. His ass is exposed." I mean, it doesn't exactly say that in the Bible, but kind of is implied. And so Noah awakes, and he's just angry at the insults that his three sons would laugh at him, and so he curses his son Ham to be forever a slave, and all his descendants to wander the earth forever. And once you begin to look at biblical illustrations, certainly by the 19th century, you begin to see that the three sons are illustrated, as I say, in traditional 19th century biblical illustration, ranging in color, with kind of Japheth, blonde and light-skinned. Sem is brown and slightly darker, and Ham is the darkest of all. And this kind of division of the three sons into what are obviously different races becomes known, certainly in the medieval time, as the Table of Nations, a kind of a racial outlook of the world that the medieval era saw and perceived. And here, as you can see, Asia is where all of Sem's descendants settled according to this table of nations. Japheth, of course, are Europeans, white Europeans, and the sons of Ham on the lower right are Africans and blacks. And so, if you read, for example, American Confederate era biblical literature and pro slavery literature, often they refer to African slaves as the sons of Ham, kind of claiming that the Bible, of course, approved slavery because of Noah's curse. Um, Asians, of course, Semites, those living in Palestine, whether they're Arabs or Jews, fall under the auspices of course, being Asian, and so Sem, you get that term eventually, Semite or anti-Semite. Although being anti-Semitic essentially technically in its usage means you're anti-Jewish. However, of course, technically speaking, Semitic people are all Asians, and mostly in popular usage, people in the Middle East, Arabs, as I say, Palestinians, um, uh, local Jews who remained in that era are considered as a Semitic people, technically speaking, but biblically speaking, of course, and in terms of usage, as I say, we associate Judaism with um, being Semitic or anti-Semitic. The term anti-Semitism, you see, often appears in two forms because there really isn't a Semitic people that we can anthropologically identify. So again, it's a kind of a social term, and so you see these two different spellings of anti-Semitism. Often academics will reject that first spelling with the S capitalized, but in other words, often academics and the sciences don't want to give approbation to the concept that there is such a thing as a Semitic people. So the term anti-Semitism is reduced in that second example below as a single word with Semitism not capitalized. It is used for the first time by Wilhelm Marr. He coins the term anti-Semitism to give a kind of a scientific quality to anti-Judaism. Wilhelm Marr is, of course, a German nationalist. He writes this book, The Way to Victory of Germanism over Judaism, when, this is in the post-Darwinian age. He again is trying to give his argument against the assimilation of Jews into the German population, a scientific ring to it. And so he introduced that term anti-Semitism, and it has remained with us today. So Wilhelm Marr, I guess we can call him the original anti-Semite. Now, I'll get back to that as well. Anti-Semitism itself has a long history. We can describe it as going through these at least 6 various phases, although other historians may break it down into other ways. You have primitive classic anti-Semitism. We're talking about the era before Christ, in kind of the first 1,000 years of Judaism, when there were conflicts between what was the kingdom of Israel occupied by various other forces. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans all had conquered Israel several times over. There were kind of anti Semitic notions incorporated in these conquests and wars. And so many of them were carried over. And again, I'll get into more detail as we go along. But essentially, that's the kind of primitive classic anti Semitism that existed before there was Christianity. We have a period of fratricidal anti-Semitism, and it's an odd short period in the history of the Jews, as some Jews were adopting what will become Christianity. There was a period where Jews considered Christ as their Messiah, and over a period of approximately 300 years from the point that Christ makes his appearance and kind of the emergence of the kind of modern Christianity, Trinitarian Christianity that we're aware of today, essentially you had a fratricidal kind of anti-Semitism. It was almost as if two sects within Judaism were at war with each other, accusing each other of various things. And of course, Christianity, you have to remember, begins as a sect within Judaism. Thus, the kind of attack that the Nazis make on Christianity, which many Nazis felt that essentially Christianity was nothing but a sect of Judaism, which technically speaking it was exactly that. After all, Christ was born a Jew, lived a Jew, and died a Jew right to the end. Christ would not have called himself a Christian. I often ask people, when did Christ become a Christian? Well, he never did. So that's what we call kind of the fratricidal period. Then you have kind of a Christian redemptive period that essentially, starting from roughly the year 300, where Christianity begins to rise to its ascendancy in Western civilization, starting in the Roman Empire, right through to the 19th century, there is this kind of tension between Christianity and Judaism, and Christian anti-Semitism, theological anti-Semitism, is often referred to as Christian redemptive anti-Semitism, in that the purpose of it was to redeem the Jews, save the Jews. The call was on the Jews to recognize Christ, and all will be forgiven, come to our side, essentially was the nature of a very complex anti, if you want to call it that, anti-Semitism within Christian theology. Once we get into the 19th century, we begin to see this kind of rapid acceleration. As everything begins to change rapidly, so does anti-Semitism. We'll see that by the middle of the 19th century, anti-Semitism begins to take on a secular racist character. We're talking about, Judaism was seen as a choice, a religion that people chose to follow. However, starting with racist anti-Semitism, Jews begin to be characterized as a race. And that, of course, is where the Nazis will pick up the thread, essentially stating that Judaism is not a choice. Once one is born a Jew, even if one converts to Catholicism or any other religion under Nazi law, they will forever remain a Jew by virtue of their blood. And that is something very new to anti-Semitism, and of course it precludes the ability of a Jew to convert to Christianity and be reaccepted into society under that kind of anti-Semitism. It very quickly will metamorphosize into nationalist, eliminationist anti-Semitism. Eliminationist anti-Semitism suggests that the Jews need to be eliminated in some way from society, although primarily the mode of elimination is isolation, for example, in ghettos, or the separation, segregation, and so forth, deportation, and of course the final kind of level of anti-Semitism, National Socialist exterminationist anti-Semitism, takes it a notch higher when we're talking about just killing the Jews. And essentially, that's what Nazism will bring to the table, that the final solution. And as we look at the history of the Holocaust, we see essentially Nazi Germany in the first phase of its regime was still contemplating some kind of eliminationist as opposed to exterminationist ideology. And so how it metamorphosized again from simply eliminationist to exterminationist, of course, is part of the Nazi historical experience. Traditionally, the Jewish people have claim an origin going back, 5,000 years. Archaeologically, historically, people in what was Palestine, we can trace them back approximately 1,000 years. They did not practice Judaism in the way we know it today. It slowly evolved over time, but there was a political kingdom, a state, Israel, with a king. It eventually split into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, where we get the term Judaism. As I say, the people were not necessarily practicing Judaism as it's known today. It's going to develop essentially its form and nature as a kind of survival mechanism as various neighboring powers begin to conquer this strip of territory that we know today as Israel and Palestine. The Assyrians are the first. They conquer Israel approximately in the year 722 BC, before Christ. The kingdom of Israel is essentially assimilated into Assyria. The kingdom of Judah just hangs on barely, with the city of Jerusalem there. And of course, Jerusalem is kind of this central point for Judaism to this day. You can see here how the Assyrian Empire kind of spread over a 200-year, 2-century period. Eventually, Judah just being the small, tiny island within the Assyrian Empire. Many of the Jews are deported from their traditional homeland, and it's during this deportation and one that occurs later as well, perpetrated by the Babylonians in these two kind of deportations of the Jewish peoples, that this kind of religion begins to emerge with a longing for Jerusalem, with a kind of centralization of the religion at a notion of a temple in Jerusalem, dietary habits, a lot of things that we associate with Judaism today emerge in these exiles as a kind of a way for these people to survive culturally while they are, as I say, in exile. So we suspect that the references to Moses rescuing his people from Egyptian captivity are based on these two exiles. The historical record, there is really nothing on the historical record of Jews being enslaved by the ancient Egyptians or working on the pyramids and so forth as slaves. We know from archaeological research that people working on the pyramids were actually paid laborers rather than slaves. So we think the whole story of Moses and the Egyptian captivity is just a parable on the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles. What eventually happens is that both the Assyrians and the Babylonians are surpassed by the Persian Empire. The Persians, or what we would refer to as Iran today, the Iranians, become a dominant power. And by around the year 500, they've, of course, now overtake the Babylonian and Assyrian empires, including what is Israel and Palestine today. And it's the Persians that essentially allow the Jews to return back to Jerusalem. And so it's in this return back to Jerusalem around the year 500 BC that kind of modern Judaism begins to take hold. The Second Temple is rebuilt now and consecrated in Jerusalem, and this temple will survive approximately 500 years until the Romans destroy it around the year 72 AD. This is what we believe that it kind of looked like. And as I say, in around 70, the Romans will burn it down, and all that will remain is this portion here, the Western Wall. And here you can see what the site of the temple looks like. There's now, of course, a holy Islamic site there as well. I think it's the second or third most holiest site in Islam, where Muhammad was said to ascend the heavens and meet with Allah before returning back to earth on his mission. And so it's a holy site for Jews as well for Christians later and later for Muslims, so all three religions. But for Judaism, of course, this wall portion here is the last surviving portion of the original temple wall, and of course now it's often referred to as the Wailing Wall, but it's better known as the Western Wall of the temple, and it's the holiest site for Judaism. So all three monotheistic religions essentially shared this wall. The Persians kind of tolerated Judaism. They were much more open in terms of multiple religions, and so the Jews in Israel kind of become a province in the Persian Empire, but then the Persians are conquered by the Greeks, and the Greeks eventually arrive around the year, certainly by the year 350 BC, the Greeks are there. And now you have kind of the Hellenization of the Jews for the first time. This kind of Middle Eastern people contact with Western civilization, and so you get this kind of blend of Western and old Eastern values merging in Judaism, and it's a split in Judaism as well as typically of any conquered people. Jewish elites begin to adopt various Greek philosophies, sometimes Greek deities. They begin to intermarry, and there is indeed a crisis of identity among Hellenized Jews and what we could begin describing as Orthodox Jews that hang on to old traditions, and so there's conflict within Judaism as well. So you can see the extent of Greek power by the third century BC, and how certainly, again, what is Israel falls into that. We can trace kind of a lot of the history by looking at Israeli coinage from that era. Here you can see a Hellenic era Israeli coin. There is a kind of image of the sun on one side, and on the other side, there's an image of an anchor. The anchor kind of symbolizing the power of the Greek navy. Like Islam, Judaism rejected the portrayal of deities and human forms of its prophets and holy people. And so you see again the sun kind of being representative of Judaism, or the lily of the field, in this case, again, with the anchor. But there eventually comes a ruling house in Greece that begins to insist that the Jews now follow Greek practices, and we begin to see images of Athena appear on Jewish coinage, and this is exactly at a moment when Jews around 168 BC are now ordered to worship Greek gods. And in fact, in 165 BC, the Greek emperor orders the temple in Jerusalem to be rededicated. 168 BC, to be rededicated to include Greek gods as well. And this, of course, triggers the first kind of known active revolt against an imperial power overseeing Israel, which will become known as the Maccabee Revolt. The Greeks go to war with the Maccabee Jews, and the Maccabees succeed. They prevail. They grind down Greek power in this huge guerrilla war, and they're victorious. In 165 BC, the Greeks back down, and the Temple of Jerusalem is rededicated. And of course, that's an event that's celebrated in Judaism today. It's one of the kind of high holy days in Judaism, Hanukkah. Often Christians refer to as the Jewish Christmas, because it occurs, around the time, around December. But of course, it's actually a almost a celebration of a military holiday. And and of course, it's in the context of, and here you can see how Greek coinage then in Israel returns back to the removal of the Greek gods. Here you can see Athena again, and Zeus on this Maccabee revolt period coinage, and it disappears. And so here we begin to get the earliest kind of anti-Semitic literature on um, on the record. Um, the interesting thing, of course, about the Jewish peoples is that they're a very literate people, and one that feel that their God is everyone's God. And that, of course, is the tradition that both Christianity and Islam have adopted from Judaism, that there's only one God, and that God is our God, and that God is your God, whether you realize it or not, and every other God is a false God. And of course, the Greeks are rather surprised that the Jews begin to um, produce literature in Greek attesting to this. Telling the Greeks that their gods are false, and only there is only one God, and that he's the Greek gods. And the Greeks themselves, of course, think this is kind of an effrontery. I mean, we're such a great civilization. How dare these Middle Eastern goat herders tell us that our great civilization has false gods? And so you get now a written response from the Greeks to these kinds of claims that Jewish writers, ancient writers, are making. In 120 BC, you get the diatribe against the Jews by Apollonius Malon. It's, as I say, the first kind of printed surviving anti-Semitic track on record, and much of what Apollonius Malon says still remains the tenet of anti-Semitism to this day. For example, Malon will write that the Jews were cast out of Egypt because they were bearers of disease, of leprosy. And that is a very common accusation, that the reason the Jews had to be put in ghetto is because they bear diseases. The Nazis will use this excuse to liquidate ghettos and kill the residents. They will claim that typhus has broken out in the Jewish ghetto, and we need to eliminate the ghetto to protect the rest of the population in the city. It's a very old accusation, as I say, going back to 120 BC, long before the birth of Christ. The Greeks also claim that Jews are disloyal to the Commonwealth, that they're unpatriotic because they only adhere to their own God. They won't show any loyalty to the empire's gods. And again, that's an accusation that will be leveled against Jews to this day, that they have no kind of sense of loyalty to the nations in which they're living, that their loyalty is strictly rooted in Zion, in Jerusalem, in the longing to return to Israel, and then to Israel once it becomes a state in 1949. So again, nothing new there. This idea of Jewish separateness, Jews won't intermarry, they won't eat with non-Jews because of dietary restrictions, that the origin of those beliefs are the Jews' hatred for other people. So it's regarded kind of as a hostile act rather than kind of a measure that Jews undertook to prevent assimilation while in exile. The Greeks accuse of Jews being a godless people because they only have one God. Both the Romans and the Greeks will make this argument, we have 1,000 gods, the Jews have only one God. Surely we must be more godly people since we have all these gods. Um, they'll argue that the Jews are cowards, that they're insolent, that um, they're parasites on civilization, that again they're a bunch of goat herders. And indeed, Jews were a nomadic, agricultural people. They did not build great cities in the way the Romans and the Greeks did. I mean, hardly anyone did in Western civilization, and so the accusations that the Jews are uncivilized, certainly by the standards of what civilization was there, made sense. Um, and moreover, there was this argument that the Jews are lazy. They don't like to work because very few civilizations had a Sabbath holiday when work was prohibited the way the Jews did. People tended to work 7 days a week, and so because the Jews practiced Sabbath, where everything came to a halt to worship God, starting from Friday sundown to till Saturday, kind of this holy period, which was unique in those times. The Jews were accused of being, as I say, lazy. So those kinds of accusations made in 120 BC stuck for the next 2,000 years, and get elaborated upon, one layer following another. So that's kind of a short summary of for you of classic old school anti-Semitism. It essentially pops out of the military defeat in the guerrilla war by Jewish Maccabees over the Greek Empire. And so you have this period then where you have kind of a revival of Israeli Zionist nationalism in this Maccabee period, and right as the next conquest now starts, and that's conquest by the Romans. And so the Roman Empire expels the Greeks, and now it becomes, a difficult period for Judaism under the Romans. The Romans, of course, suppress Maccabean Judaism, and um, they install their own governor, Herod, famous, of course, by the biblical accounts. He is a kind of puppet of the Roman Empire, very much hated in Judaic history. All sorts of accusations of Herod, including, that horrible story about the murder of all the infants because Herod is worried that a Messiah has been born who might unseat him. Um, Herod, of course, did kill some of his own children, so some historians believe that Herod's murder of his own children kind of inspired that passage. Herod, of course, murdered his wife as well. He was apparently a necrophile. On top of that, according to, again, tradition, he preserved his wife's corpse in honey and would continue to have sex with her corpse. So quite a kind of mad figure in this difficult biblical era. There's Masada, this kind of fortress where Herod ensconced himself because he was so paranoid. He lived on top of this mountain, which will also later figure in the great Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire. There's Herod's temple that stood high up on top of this mountain, which tells us a lot about Herod. Here's his tomb as well, kind of this inaccessible mountaintop tomb. So in this period, Of course, Judaism now splits into these political factions. You have kind of Hellenized, powerful Jewish faction known as the Sadducees. These are Jews that control the temple at that moment. These are Jews that are compliant with the Roman Empire. They get advantages. They're privileged by virtue of their compliance with the Roman Empire. They're collaborators. We could describe them as the Vichy French, if you want, in Second World War terms. The second party are the Pharisees. The Pharisees are also kind of compliant, but they oppose the Sadducees. They essentially question the power of the Sadducees over the temple, their alliance with the Herod family and the Herod clan, and the Pharisees kind of are a loyal opposition, if you want to call them. And then you have the Essenes, and the Essenes are kind of ultra Orthodox Jews that reject both the Sadducees and Pharisees and eventually leave Jerusalem to set up a community of their own on the Dead Sea. And we have some good evidence and suspicions that Jesus Christ probably emerged from the Essene sect. But they're kind of super Jews, rebellious Jews. The Pharisees become radicalized, and so you have this fourth philosophy that begins to emerge among the Pharisees, who become known as the Zealots, from where we get the term zealous today. The Zealots means emulator or admirer or follower. Their political platform is that Jews should pay no taxes to Rome, that paying taxes to a foreign power is equivalent to slavery, that Israel should be a theocracy and not ruled by any foreign power, and that if Israel actively resists foreign powers like Rome, God will establish his kingdom on earth. This combination of Essene rejection of Jerusalem society and their withdrawal from Israel and kind of Pharisee resistance begins to come to a head in this period where Christ, about whom we know really very little, really Christ's life is only documented for about 3 years of his life, from about the age of 30 to 33 when he's crucified. Everything about his childhood is really not in the Bible. If you reread it, it's mostly Christian tradition, stories about Jesus as a child, as a carpenter, as a fisherman. There's nothing in the biblical text attesting to that. So we really don't know where Christ was when, Jesus was when he was in his 20s. I mean, Christ, of course, just means Messiah. It's not even, a name. In any regards, the Essenes will leave these old biblical texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, in these caves. That again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are recovered in around the 1940s. They first become to be discovered. So we suspect that a lot of the theology that is attributed to Jesus later is emerging out of Essene theology. So Jesus is indeed arrested by the Romans. He is tried and executed by the Romans. as a rebel against Rome. The charges are unclear, but crucifixion is the punishment for rebels. And again, contrary to often myth, it's not the Jews that conspired to kill Jesus, although probably it could have been a Sadducee or Pharisee faction working with the Romans that assisted them in this execution. But he's tried in a Roman court and executed in a Roman court, and that's going to be important to what's going to become fratricidal anti-Semitism and as I say, Christian redemptive anti-Semitism. This figure of Jesus and his resurrection. The Zealots, as they get radicalized even further, there's a kind of terrorist group that emerges called the Sicari, the bearers of a dagger, assassins that essentially begin assassinating mostly Jewish collaborators, but also attacking Roman power. And this eventually triggers a revolt in Jerusalem around the year 70-72, resulting in the burning of Jerusalem, the complete destruction of the city, pulling down of its walls. That's when the temple is destroyed.
What were they called
Jerusalem is
again?
destroyed. Here you can see what remains of the West Wall. And the Jews are expelled from Jerusalem, and eventually they will be, about 100 years later, expelled from that territory altogether. So there's the West Wall, the remains of that temple is destroyed by the Romans. The Jews will withdraw to Masada, the Zealots, and there they will hold out in this last siege in Herod's former temple. Masada, of course, is well suited for a siege. It has spring water up on top, so you can hold out there forever. The Jews carve out these large cisterns in the mountain to collect the water, and so they hold out for something like 2 years until the Romans. There's I think 3 Roman legions besiege Masada, and eventually the Romans just pile up this ramp that you see there, and then they charge up the ramp and break into Masada. And of course, at this point, the remaining zealots, according to tradition and certainly accounts by Josephus, commit suicide. And that's the end of Israel, essentially, until 1949, where the state, 2,000 years approximately later, comes back into existence. Or, remarkable tale of a kind of a people's survival. We can see how important this is to the Romans by just their coinage. You can see the Jewish weeping widow and the Roman centurions standing over the weeping widow as a symbol of the conquest of Israel or Judea. Here you can see this is a Judean coin. The Romans as well will build this celebratory arch just outside the Colosseum, the Arch of Titus. And on the sides of the arch, you can see Jewish slaves from the conquest being brought to Rome carrying the temple treasures, including the gold menorah that will vanish when the Visigoths conquer Rome about 200 years later and sack Rome, and the temple of Jerusalem treasures will vanish forever, and treasure hunters are still looking for it. The theory is that it was buried in a Visigothic grave somewhere in the south of France. So the triumphal arch of Titus. There is, again, kind of tradition in Judaism that any Jew who walks under this arch in Rome ceases to be a Jew. But that's, as I say, kind of tradition. It has no kind of foundation in theology. So at issue here, of course, um, this conquest of Israel, as it's happening around the year 72, is occurring, and the siege of Masada and so forth is occurring right almost at exactly the same time as the first of the four Gospels of the New Testament are being written down and assembled from kind of oral traditions in primitive Christianity. The You have three so-called synoptic gospels: the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew. Again, we often traditionally think that these are written by the disciples of Jesus, but they're not, and that's not the claim. They're written, like as I say, the Gospel of Mark is believed to be the first one, and it's written around the year 70, so nearly 35 years after the death of Jesus. Neither Luke nor Matthew lived in the time of Jesus. Mark might have, by virtue of his age, might have seen Jesus when he was a child at best. Mark was writing, and this is important, he was writing for essentially a Roman and Greek speaking readership. And he's trying to essentially um, promote the figure of Jesus to a hostile readership, the Romans. And so it becomes very important to Mark as he's writing the Gospel of Mark, which will then, as you can see, they're called synoptic gospels because 76% of what's in Mark will appear in Luke and Matthew. The Gospels of John, of course, being the one asynoptic gospel that has original material in it that doesn't seem to be derived from Mark. So Mark essentially will characterize much of what the New Testament and the tenets of modern Christianity become. And so it's important for Mark to separate Jesus from the rebelling Jews. And it's Mark who begins to portray Jesus as kind of a good, loyal Jew. And eventually, a good, loyal Jew will become known as a Christian. And so Orthodox Jews begin to dispute Christian Jews, if you want to call them that at that moment. And that's when you have fratricidal anti-Semitism as both sides begin to accuse each other of things. So when you get that passage, for example, it's very suspicious how there's in the biblical passages about people asking Jesus, well, Jesus, should I pay my taxes to the Romans? And Jesus says immediately, render what is Caesar's unto Caesar, and what is God's unto God. In other words, pay your taxes. If you're a good Jew, you pay taxes to the Roman Empire. And so that's how essentially Christianity begins to develop its own identity to the point that eventually it will no longer be seen as a sect of Judaism, and now it kind of becomes important for this myth that bad Jews killed Jesus, the good Jew, and so we get this story of course, of the Roman governor, a good Roman, who, oh, I don't want to kill Jesus. He brings Jesus out before a crowd, and the crowd, right, in that biblical passage in the Gospel of Matthew, right, chapter 27, verse 25, Jesus is brought before this Jewish crowd, and Pilate says, I'll execute three criminals in return. Give you Jesus back, and the crowd all shouts, no, 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 we want Jesus dead. And of course Matthew comments. He says, then all the people cried out before Pilate, his blood be on us and on our children, the so-called blood curse. And so now 2,000 years of anti-Semites are going to claim that the Jews deserve to die because they themselves accepted this curse on themselves and their descendants in exchange for their murder of Christ. That the Jews are Christ killers, and all this again emerges because the New Testament essentially is being put to paper in this period where Jews and Romans are at war. It would be like an American historian, for example, trying to write a positive history of a positive biography of Osama bin Laden at the moment that the World Trade Center is under attack for an American audience. How do you sell Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, right, in a positive way? And so the argument kind of might have been was that it's the bad Muslims that brought down the World Trade Center, but Osama bin Laden wasn't about that. Al Qaeda were the really good Muslims, or the other way around, if you want to argue. It's a difficult sell to sell what will become known as Christianity to the Romans in that period. And so when we see these kinds of persecutions of Christians, often we don't realize that it's very difficult for the Romans to separate who are Jewish Christians and who are what we would describe as Orthodox Jews, and so often in the Roman mind, who they're persecuting is actually a sect of Judaism, and thus again you see these accusations of Christians being hauled into Roman forums and being executed by the Romans because they hate other people and they won't accept other people's gods. Well, that was what the Greeks had said about the Jews back in the time of Apollonius Milan, and now it's applied towards the Christians. So eventually, of course, I wish I had more time to get into the nitty-gritty of it, but of course, Emperor Constantine gives Christianity kind of approbation. He prohibits essentially all discrimination against all religions, not just Christianity, but Christianity ends up favored as the Roman Empire expands. It adopts Christianity as a religion that other peoples can join because of kind of the multicultural aspect of the Roman Empire. And of course, by the year 350, Christianity now begins to dominate Western civilization. Constantine, by the way, it said, is the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity. He actually does this on his deathbed. If you look at coinage from the Constantine age, you see that Constantine still shares the coin with the sun god, Sol Invictus. And in fact, it's at this point that Christianity moves their holy Sabbath day from Saturday in the Jewish tradition to Sunday because of Constantine's position as Pontificus Maximus in the cult of Sol Invictus. The sun god is still the major religion, and Christian traditions often are merged with pagan traditions of sun worship, which is how we ended up celebrating Christmas during Yuletide, for example. So here you can see again Constantine Cottage, the sun god, is a primary figure. Again, the sun right here. It's very late in Constantine's rulership that the Cairo, that symbol of Christianity, is adopted in the Roman Empire. But certainly, as I say, by 350, there's so many different versions of Christianity that Constantine brings all these Christians bishops together in the Council of Nicaea, and you have the Nicene Creed, which defines modern Christianity today and defines heresy, what it means to be a heretical Christian and what it means to be a Trinitarian acceptable Christian is defined from that point on, and you have the rise of kind of Trinitarian Christianity today. And now the dominant Judaic sect is no longer Judaic. It is now clearly a thing of its own, Christianity. It goes to work on the former opposition, the Jews. And we begin to see now the Roman Catholic Church, as it becomes predominant in the West, introduce a number of canonical laws that begin to define what we would call Christian redemptive anti-Semitism. The intermarriage and sexual intercourse between Christian and Jews is prohibited in the year 306. Jews and Christians are prohibited from eating together. Jews are not allowed to hold public office. Jews are not allowed to employ Christian servants or possess Christian slaves. Jews are prohibited from showing themselves in the streets during the weeks before Easter. The Talmud and other Jewish scriptures are now burnt. Christians are prohibited from patronizing Jewish physicians. Christians are prohibited from living in homes owned by Jews. Jews are now obligated to pay taxes for support of the Christian church in the same way as Christians are. You have the first Sunday blue laws introduced in the year 1000. As Jews, of course, their Sabbath remains on Saturday, and so Jewish businesses, stores, markets would open on Sunday, and of course Christians found that competition, and so prohibition for everybody is banned on Sunday. Jews are not permitted to be plaintiffs or witnesses against Christians in court. Jews are not permitted to withhold inheritance from descendants who convert to Christianity. By the year 1215, Jews are marked physically, their clothing. Jews are required in certain territories to wear blue belts. This is are required to wear yellow belts. In Christian territories, and it's a law modeled on an Islamic law that decreed that Christians wear blue belts and Jews wear yellow belts to identify them. Christians are prohibited from attending Jewish ceremonies. Jews are not permitted to dispute, in other words, argue with simple Christian people, in other words, illiterate Christians, about the tenets of Catholic religion. And then 1267, you have the introduction of compulsory ghettos. Ghetto is a term that derives from Venetian language. The earliest ghettos were formed in Venice. Jews were expelled from the Venetian general population to a part of Venice where they had metal foundries that were forced to leave because they became a fire hazard. In the Venetian dialect, to forge metal in a foundry, the term was gettare, and so you get the term ghetto, because where those foundries were was known as the ghetto area. And so that's the origin of the word ghetto. It's distinguished in Venice because it's one of the few places in Venice where buildings are kind of higher than the usual 2 or 3 stories that Venetian buildings are. And the ghetto still survives to this day, although the Nazis, of course, once they occupy Italy, are going to decimate the population of the ghetto of Venice. We begin to see in medieval iconography Jews portrayed wearing that hat that you see right there as being physically marked. They're communing, of course, with demons. And we don't have a concerted effort to kill the Jews, but you get these pogroms, often crusaders on their way to the Crusades in Jerusalem, on the way attack Jewish communities. During Easter, um, celebration. Sometimes local bishops provoke the population to attack Jews, but there is no systematic attempt to murder the Jews because um, the nature of redemptive anti-Semitism is that the Jews must be redeemed. And the position of the popes in the end will always be that the Jews have to be saved to fulfill Christ's mission on earth as the Messiah of the Jewish people. That when the Jews accept Christ as their Messiah is when, of course, the biblical mission of Jesus is completed. So there is this kind of schizophrenic relationship between Roman Catholicism and Judaism. There is this kind of condemnation of Judaism. There is this kind of exclusion of Jews, but it's intended to kind of persuade Jews to convert to Christianity. And once a Jew converts to Christianity, he's welcomed into the community and so forth, which is not going to be the case with racial anti-Semitism or eliminationist anti-Semitism of the modern era. If you want to get deeper into it, Rosemary Radford Reuter, a former nun who leaves Catholicism, and she will write this book, Faith and Fratricide, The Theological Roots of Anti-Semitism, when she looks at this approximately 1,500-year period where often anti-Semitic traditions are legalized in the form of canon law, in the form of ghettos. You got to remember that Jews who are sent to ghettos as well are prohibited from owning property. As they say, they're prohibited from attending universities. They have very little activity that they're allowed to do. One of it, of course, is money lending. And of course, Christians are not allowed to loan money because it's considered usury if you charge an interest. And the other reason, of course, is Jews faced with being expelled have very liquid property, gold, diamonds, cash, that they can just throw in a bag and take with them if they're expelled. And so being kind of bankers makes perfect sense as to what Jews can do. So Rosemary Radford Reuter, a number of articles she writes about this. Um, Yosef Haim Yerushalmi, also in that book edited by Fleischer, um, responds to Rosemary Reuter, arguing that certainly Christianity was not inherently anti-Semitic, so you could have two sides of the coin in that literature. Also, very helpful, an article by Kenneth Stowe on the papal policy towards Jews in the Middle Ages. The popes all condemned anti-Semitism, despite the fact, again, local bishops or cardinals often would be disobedient to the Pope. We often imagine the Vatican kind of as monolithic a state as the Third Reich. In fact, it isn't. Yes, the Pope has kind of Führer-like powers, but the Gauleiters in the Vatican, the cardinals, have a lot of power. And often bishops and cardinals will follow their own path and take their chances and come in conflict with their pope. So popes find it as difficult to kind of manage their cardinals and the curia, the bureaucracy of the Vatican, despite the kind of powers that we often imagine the Pope having. It is as chaotic an authoritarian system as Nazism was. So, the so-called, for example, there's another kind of blood curse, the blood myth that Jews abduct children on Passover and drain their blood for these rituals. It often triggered pogroms in Europe. There were a number of Vatican investigations of whether this was true, and all these Vatican investigations publicly concluded that this is a lie. So the church establishment in Catholicism certainly stood in the position that the Jews are not to be destroyed because they have to be there for salvation. But certainly traditions are carried on, as I say, into the modern age. You, of course, get this huge migrations of Jewish populations as Jews in various periods of time are expelled. Royal families come in various flavors of anti-Semitism. Some are more anti-Semitic, some are less with time. So there are moments where rulers choose to expel Jewish populations. And the kind of medieval expulsions to Eastern Europe, where a Polish prince is sympathetic with the Jews and welcomes these huge Jewish settlements that will survive right into the 20th century in Eastern Europe, where you get kind of this emergence of a modern Orthodox Judaism. Is where the death camps will be out in Poland, in that region, in the Ukraine, in Western Russia, and so forth. Martin Luther in 1500 introduces kind of a new aspect to anti-Semitism. He virulently demands that synagogues be burnt down, that the Talmud be burned. Martin Luther is, although he still kind of accepts the conversion of Jews to Protestantism. He's very suspicious of so-called new Christians. And so eventually you begin to see, and this occurs in Spain as well, kind of Jews converted to Christianity get labeled as new Christians. So they're kind of a category of Christian that is not quite as pure as the pure Christian. Napoleon, of course, brings the values of enlightenment to the West. And one of the things Napoleon, of course, believes in is citizenship. He himself has kind of anti Semitic sentiments, but he feels that under Republican model, Jews are citizens like anyone else and should have equal rights. And so it's Napoleon that first grants Jews under the French Revolutionary Republic equal rights, emancipation. It's he who begins to close ghettos, and so Napoleon, even though he will be defeated, the traditions and the values, of course, of enlightenment now begin to take hold in Europe, and you begin to see the Jews of Europe progressively emancipated from the various restrictions that they were under. And there you can see the various years of the emancipations. Prussia, for example, emancipates its Jews in 1850. Hungary, 1867. Italy by 1870. The Ottoman Empire, 1908. Britain, 1890. Spain is the last, 1930. And in fact, that's one of the things that triggers the Spanish Civil War, the emancipation of the Jews in Spain. So certainly when Prussia unifies Germany, it emancipates automatically all the Jews of Germany in 1871. And so as Jews become emancipated, many begin to assimilate now into European society, and focusing on Germany, many begin to assimilate in German society. They no longer wear kind of identifiable Orthodox garb. Some Jews are not particularly religious. Some might even convert to Christianity. Jews primarily move into the urban sector, and Jews are ironically at an advantage as industrialization begins to sweep over Europe, because certainly the agricultural agrarian civilization was fueled by land ownership. But of course, the Industrial Revolution and power in the Industrial Revolution is fueled not by land, but by capitalism. And because Jews were not allowed to own real estate and had all their assets in liquid capital, Jews are in particularly good position to take advantage of the emerging industrial capitalist phenomenon that's occurring. And so suddenly old school agrarian wealthy families and at least affluent families, as they have all this land that's becoming worthless, they're burning their furniture essentially to heat their home. They're seeing Jews with liquid capital now entering into industrial businesses. The days of kind of handcraft merchants is ending to inventory department store kind of structure that again Jews with liquid capital and no real estate burden begin to enter, and so people are now becoming suspicious of their own kind of inability to advance in this new industrial world, and suspicious of Jews suddenly rising to in this new kind of industrial economy. So that begins to fuel suspicion and hatred as well. But you're looking at photographs of Jews in late 19th and 20th century, European Jews, and you can't really, from the photograph, identify them necessarily as Jews. I mean, the people you're looking at certainly have darker Semitic-like features. They could be Armenian, they could be Iranian, Lebanese, Turkish, or they could be Jews. But there's nothing about them that identifies them in the way Eastern European Orthodox Jews might be identified. We know they're Jews because the photographs you're looking at are photographs left behind in a death camp of Jews that were exterminated in a death camp. They're Jews, but they look like everybody else. That's why, of course, the Nazis will have to end up sewing these identification markers on Jews, because Nazi kooky racial science that says you can recognize a Jew by the shape of their head or the shape of their nose is absolute nonsense, and they know it. That's why, as I say, they're going to be identifying Jews as soon as they're children. They'll be required to wear that star. And so, as Jews are assimilating into German society, which is something that 1500 years of Christian redemptive anti-Semitism had encouraged, you now find a generation of German nationalists who begin to question whether this is a good thing, like Wilhelm Marr, who suggests that in fact the assimilation of Jews is actually destroying the German race and is a threat. And now we begin to see that kind of idea of a racial ecology, and that quote Jewish blood can infect pure German racial blood. And so we get the first kind of notions of Judaism as a race, as opposed to a religion of choice. And Daniel Goldhagen, in his very controversial book from the mid-1990s, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans in the Holocaust, when he studies pre-Nazi German anti-Semitism, he argues that German anti-Semitism begins to acquire a uniquely eliminationist character to it, that Jews need to be segregated away, eliminated from German society. They need to be identified in some way. Who's a Jew, who isn't a Jew, because now Jews look too much like Germans. So we need to find out what's in their blood and separate them. And that this characterizes German anti-Semitism much more than, say, French anti-Semitism or Russian anti-Semitism or other American anti-Semitism and so on. And that gradually, long before Hitler, a significant proportion of German anti-Semitic literature suggests that perhaps the Jews might need to be exterminated physically, the way the National Socialists will. Sarah Gordon, in Hitler, Germans, and the Jewish Question, Sarah Gordon studies those SD public opinion reports. And Sarah Gordon concludes that essentially from the SD reports, German popular opinion is divided into three different factions, two small factions and one large faction. 10 to 15% of Germans wholeheartedly approve German anti-Semitic policies. 10 to 15% wholeheartedly condemn German anti-Semitic policies and are opposed to it. And she finds that these two 10 to 15% extremes on the two poles go back and forth depending upon how visible and how violent the Nazi anti-Semitic policies are. And the SD reports that whenever there are public acts against Jews like pogroms, boycotts, smashing windows of Jewish storefronts, that public opinion turns against Nazi anti-Semitic policies at those moments. And the conclusion is not that Germans may be necessarily sympathetic to Jews under attack, but the Germans, kind of as Bissell argues in his essay, that Germans are longing for stability and order in the streets. That German homemakers, for example, don't want to walk to a store far away because the one that they were buying milk at nearby is now being boycotted by SA stormtroopers, or they don't want to see broken glass in the streets. So, when Hitler said he liked cold, scientific anti Semitism, that he didn't like violent Semitism because he thought it wasn't very productive, I have to credit Hitler with understanding the German people. Certainly, the SD supports that the moment anti-Semitism is kind of um, publicly expressed, the number of Germans condemning anti-Semitic policy rises. But it still remains in that kind of poll of 10 to 15%, and 10 to 15% hard-heartedly supporting. So what it means is the middle, roughly 70 to 75% of Germans actually, like the rest of us, have no opinion. They just don't care either way. And that, of course, is the problem. And when you have 70% of people who kind of will shrug and say, well, I'm not a Jew, and I have no Jews in my family, so I don't care really. That's basically the SD conclusion, that roughly 70% of the Germans, it didn't affect their daily life, and they couldn't care less. And I think that's, as I say, is typical of a lot of political issues. You have roughly 70% to 75% of a population that will just shrug their shoulders and say, as long as it's not a problem for me, whatever. So, in any regard, Sarah Gordon's findings are certainly interesting on those two numbers. Shalomit Volkov, she argues in this particular article as well that what makes Nazi exterminationist anti-Semitism, that sixth level of anti-Semitism, unique is that it's verbally expressed rather than through texts, through persuasive text. She says it addresses a different part of the brain, that through speeches, rallies, through movies and so forth, there is a kind of crowd mentality that drives Nazi exterminationist anti-Semitism. And we can draw parallels to, certainly, if we look at medieval era anti-Semitism, when were these anti-Semitic attacks most virulent? They were most virulent where there were these kinds of Christian pageants, holidays, when bishops may have spoken to a congregation. So again, verbally, people are inspired as opposed to kind of reading persuasive texts. And certainly in the Middle Ages, people were mostly illiterate. So her argument is, of course, it's the power of the word. And, in Rwanda, of course, in 1995, 94, the genocide is triggered by disc jockeys calling out on the radio for the Hutu tried to exterminate the cockroaches who were the Tutsis in Rwanda. In Cambodia, there were loudspeakers constantly calling on people to fight counter revolutionaries. So this idea of kind of the verbal power inspiring people in a different way, then written persuasive text is an interesting and dangerous argument, of course, in the time of social media and YouTube, Facebook, and other things that I would not exactly call, I wouldn't exactly call a tweet a work of literature. If it's somewhere between a kind of short verbal cry and audio cry. It's not persuasive text and editorial, say. And of course, with this mass of information, people are consuming information in kind of capsule form that they can swallow rather than a long written discourse. So, just before I give you your 5 minute break, when we look at those canonical laws and then we look at Nazi racial laws, we will see that the Nazis introduce every canonical law that I had listed will have a Nazi equivalent decree to it, passed starting from 1933. Okay, let me give you a 5 minute break here before I continue, and I'll answer any questions anybody has during the break. Okay, moving forward. Um, so essentially, the Nazi Party is going to model its legal racial laws based on many of the canonical laws restricting um, Jewish participation in medieval life. These charts come from what I would certainly describe as the definitive book on the Holocaust. Uh, Raoul Hilberg took about nearly 40 years to write this book. It's a massive study, uh, kind of hard to get. I don't think it's available in ebook form. It was published in 1985, The Destruction of the European Jews. Um, it's a remarkable book because Raoul Hilberg essentially sets out to look at the Holocaust from the Nazi point of view. What was the problem that the Nazis defined, and how did they seek to solve it? So it's essentially a history of the Nazi state bureaucracy and how it functioned, from the Foreign Office to the Post Office to the railroads, to the SS and Gestapo and the concentration camp system. But essentially, Hilberg focuses on the killing bureaucracy as opposed to narratives of the Jewish peoples who are caught up in the Holocaust, which I think are adequately covered by other works, and so Hilberg um, divides essentially the process into these four phases, and he says that this applies to modern day genocides as well, not necessarily strictly to the Holocaust. He says, first, a targeted people need to be defined and then identified. Who it is, who is going to be targeted, and then how do we identify them from everyone else. Uh, Secondly, the next phase is expropriation of the wealth and power of the targeted people. Their property is seized, their holdings, their land, their ability to make a living, their professional licensing, their education, their political rights, the right to vote, the right to speak, and so forth. All that is part of the expropriation process. Then the third phase is a kind of deportation and or concentration of those people to a single physical, and I guess today certainly we can say in a kind of digital environment, even perhaps, as we increasingly live in a kind of a digital world, but essentially a deportation of those people and a concentration of them, grouping of them together. And once those first three phases are achieved, he says that the fourth phase, extermination, becomes a natural extension of what occurred in the first three phases. And so, as the Nazis come to power, Hitler and National Socialism, of course, has adopted this Völkische notion that I had described very early in these lectures, the idea of a kind of a pure German or pure Aryan, in quotation marks, environment or Aryan racial ecology, And the idea, of course, that Jews are a race, that Judaism is somehow transmitted in the blood. The Nazis now begin to introduce a number of laws that will express this new form of anti Semitism. We already saw it in the decree for the reestablishment of a professional civil service. But the problem there, of course, that law was passed April 7th, 1933, shortly after the Enabling Act. But the problem is that they have not quite yet defined what is a Jew. And we see a number of kind of improvised acts undertaken without a Jew yet being defined under German law. For example, October 4th, 1933, newspaper editors who are Jewish will be dismissed as non-Aryan. May 21st, 1935, being an Aryan becomes a prerequisite for military services. But the first kind of clear definitions of who a Jew is will come in two laws that will follow one and the other about the same time. You have, first of all, you have a draconian law called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, the so-called blood laws. The Nuremberg race laws, because they're announced in Nuremberg. September 15th, 1935. The blood law prohibits marriage and extramarital sexual intercourse between Jews and Aryans, and the employment of Aryan women under the age of 45 in Jewish households. That's the law that defines race relations between Jews and Germans as Rassenschade, or race pollution. Again, kind of using an ecological term. So it becomes a felony. But who is a Jew isn't really defined until 2 months later, when you have the Reich citizenship law introduced in November 14th, 1935. And the Reich citizenship law now formally defines who's a Jew. And so it took Germans almost 3 years, 2.5 years, of lawyers arguing with each other and various government functionaries before they came up with a definition of who's a Jew. And once they had these kinds of charts that you're seeing are going to be distributed throughout Germany in police stations, post offices, hotels, anywhere where people are in contact with the public, basically defining who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, kind of as a guide. And you're looking at the English translation version of it. And so, according to the law, a Jew is descendant from 3 Jewish grandparents. That makes him a full or her a full or 3/4 Jew. So a 3/4 Jew is a full Jew. A half Jew is descended from 2 Jewish grandparents, and A, belongs to the Jewish community on or after September 15th, 1935. In other words, they attend a synagogue, practice their religion. B, or is married to a Jew. Or C, is an offspring of a marriage contracted between a quarter or full Jew or is an offspring of an extramarital relationship with a three-quarter or full Jew and born out of wedlock. That defines you as a full Jew or a half Jew. So, in other words, you are who your grandparents were. And so, even if your grandparents were born Jews but converted to Christianity, and your parents converted to Christianity, and you were raised as a Christian, if your grandparents were born as Jews and registered in German birth records as Jews, you are a Jew. No matter of your, you could be a bishop in the Catholic Church, but if your grandparents were Jews, you're a Jew, and there's no escaping, there's no converting, nothing. That's what makes National Socialist anti-Semitism so particularly different from all the others, and it traps people. There's no escape. There's no conversion. There's only going into hiding, essentially hiding your grandparents' origins. That's why genealogists will become so powerful in Germany. A positive genealogical report can be a kiss of death, or a negative report. In other words, that you have no Jewish ancestors can save your life. A half Jew or a Mischlinge is defined as anyone who descends from two Jewish grandparents, but who does not adhere to the Jewish religion and who's not married to a Jew. And you have two degrees of a half Jew. You have first degree half Jew and a second degree half Jew. A second degree half Jew is less of a Jew. It's someone who is descendant from one Jewish grandparent. In other words, they're one quarter Jew. And of course, this took the Nazis a long time to argue. The argument here that was being held was, well, here we have, okay, he's quarter Jew, but that means he's three-quarters German. Are we going to save the three-quarter German, or are we going to kill the one-quarter Jew? And then statisticians kind of looked at what the impact would be on, first of all, the taxation. If we begin to expel Jews from the workplace and they're not paying income tax anymore, and what about military services? So, for example, second-degree Mischlinge, quarter Jews, are allowed to serve in the German military. So you had quarter Jews serving in the German military, but only if they did not practice Judaism. In other words, they considered themselves non-practicing Jews or converted Jews. Those were, as they say, the Mischlinger. Half Jews cannot marry either. If a half Jew marries another half Jew, they each will make each other full Jews. And likewise, if two married half Jews divorce, they get a slightly higher status because they're no longer considered being married as a full Jew category. They get their half Jew status. So sometimes some couples divorced to survive. So quarter Jews, of course, had that narrow margin of being able to survive as such in the Third Reich. And as I say, some served even in the German military forces, the regular army. They would not have been accepted, for example, in the SS that demanded absolute pure racial purity going back to 1750. So even a single Jewish grandparent would have cut that out. But it certainly defines what the situation is going to be for the rest of Jews in Germany. So here you can see the kind of racial structure of the Nuremberg blood laws and the citizenship law as it's going to impact German Jews and later Jews who's going to be classified as a Jew in the occupied territories in France and Amsterdam and Poland and so forth. Here, for example, ich bin ein Rassenschänder, I've been a race polluter. This couple, of course, will end up in a German concentration camp, as they will as well. Any questions at all about kind of the German Nazi definition, racial definition, how it worked?
Sir, quick question. Is there any estimate as to how much of the German population was actually mixed? I mean, assuming because Jews have been in Germany for a long time.
There probably is. I couldn't tell you offhand how many were considered Mischlinge, but that statistic might be out there. I'm trying to remember the exact number of Jews in Germany. So there were approximately, I think, maybe 600,000 Jews in the German population, maybe 300,000, somewhere between 600 to 300,000. I think probably 300,000. So it's not an extraordinary amount of people, actually, when you think that the German population was somewhere between 60, 80 million. So if you cut that number down to how many may have been out of that, we're talking about a minuscule population, under 5%. The first thing, of course, as I say, is the expropriation of Jews from society. Jews, of course, are segregated. They have separate seating on buses, benches, and so forth. We saw that Jews, as I say, will be excluded from certain professions. Anti-Semitic policies in Nazi Germany at first are kind of slow because of kind of the Olympics coming, and so they really the Nazis didn't want this to be a big embarrassment during the Olympics, where all these visiting countries were. So really things begin to kick in after the 1936 Olympics, 37, 38. Anti-Semitic policies begin starting to get ramped up. One of the sort of primary decrees, the Jewish Enterprise Decree, will define a Jewish enterprise as any business owned by a Jew or that has a Jew as a legal representative or on the board of directors. And of course, any enterprise defined as a Jewish enterprise will become subject to compulsory Aryanization after a certain date. And so many Jews find themselves just selling off their companies at discount rate to Germans who buy up these companies, as I say, as Jews are desperate to sell their businesses before Aryanization becomes compulsory. So that's introduced June 14th, 1938. July to December of 1938, Jewish doctors, lawyers, retail stores are required to liquidate their operations. And after November 38, it becomes compulsory that all Jewish enterprises liquidate through the Aryanization process and sell themselves to exclusively German owners. Huge profits are made. There's a number of cases. Jews are suing the German courts, even though Hitler has kind of subverted, I guess, the judiciary. Uh, Jews are still taking their chances, although they're not doing that well. For example, there is a Supreme Court case in 1936 where a Jewish stage manager under contract to a movie company is dismissed. He sues the movie company, arguing that his contract provided that he may be dismissed in the case of sickness, death, or similar causes rendering his work impossible, but there's nothing in his contract about his racial characteristics as meriting dismissal. And so he takes this to a lower court, and the lower court rules in his favor. The movie company then appeals through a number of appeal courts that again hold up the Jewish plaintiff's case. The decision in his favor. Finally, it's the German Supreme Court now, under Hitler's thumb, that eventually rules that although his contract provided that he may be dismissed on only sickness, death, or similar causes, that, quote, his racial characteristics are equivalent to either sickness or death, and therefore he can be dismissed. So here we begin to see kind of judges practicing what the Nazis in their 25 points are calling upon German common law, as opposed to Roman codified law. And so we're beginning to see how these cases are now being interpreted in kind of strictly Nazi ideology. So huge profits are made as these Jewish businesses are being Aryanized. The Nazis are encouraging Jews to leave Germany. Jews are desperate to get out, many. And it's easy for somebody like Einstein to get a visa to go to the United States and settle in Princeton, where he'll live out the rest of his life, or Sigmund Freud to leave Austria once it's occupied by the Nazis in the Anschluss. Everybody is happy to admit Sigmund Freud and Einstein, but if you're not a particularly wealthy or prominent Jewish scientist or artist, you're not going to find a place to go to. Most countries, first of all, are suffering from the depression. Certainly, Canada is, in defense of Canada's kind of strict immigration policy in the 1930s. We're not admitting anybody to Canada in the 1930s. We're in the depth of the depression. So that's one defense that one can give to kind of Canada's, partly anti-Semitic as well, disinterest in bringing Jews to refugees to Canada. So Jews are as much as the Nazis are as they urging them on, and of course they're seizing a portion of anybody who immigrates from Germany. They have to pay a so-called flight tax, a departure tax that seizes a good portion of their property. I'm trying to remember again. It's something like the flight tax is somewhere in the vicinity of 40% or something like something there. It's a huge amount of seizure of their taxable property prior to being able to leave. So the Nazis certainly are profiting as well from the expulsion of the Jews. So it becomes such an issue that in July of 1938, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president, um, sponsors an international conference on Jewish refugees at Evian, the Evian conference, July 38. And of course, this is where that famous quote comes from Canada, none is too many, as Mackenzie King and the Liberal cabinet are very worried about attending the Evian conference. And what if the Evian conference calls on all the participants to admit a number of Jewish refugees from Germany into their country? And that's when that Canadian official says to Mackenzie King, don't worry, none is too many. And indeed, he didn't need to worry. Um, Hitler, by the way, when the Evian conference is held, says, I can only hope that the other world, which has such deep sympathy for these criminals, will at least be generous enough to convert this sympathy into practical aid. We, on our part, are ready to put all these criminals at the disposal of these countries for all I care, even on luxury ships. And of course, what happens at Evian is, except for one country, all the other countries refuse to grant Jewish refugees any kind of additional visas or admission into their countries. This is what appears in the New York Times, July 3rd, 1938, after the conference, nothing. Jews are trapped in Germany. They can't get out. They're lined up at all these various German police officers. The Nazis happily stamp an exit visa into their passport, but now they need an entry visa from another country, and those countries are not giving it to them. By now, Eichmann, Department 4B4, remember in the Gestapo, is in charge of this, quote, evacuation process. He streamlines the German bureaucracy, where it's very quick for Jews to, in a kind of assembly line process, in a Gestapo office, to get all their stamps. They pay their tax, they hand over their registration, their passport is stamped, they're given their tax receipt, all very quickly, and leave anytime you find a place that will accept you. And the problem, as I say, is getting out. Looking at, actually, there's Eichmann right there, in front of one of those offices in the 1930s. Eichmann is a late joiner. He actually isn't German. He's Austrian. Some major figures in Nazi Germany, particularly in the Holocaust, are actually Austrians. So they come late to the Nazi structure. They come with the Anschluss in 1938. Eichmann presents himself as a self-educated expert on Judaism. That's how he sells himself and begins to kind of promote himself in the Gestapo bureaucracy in Department 4B4. He studies Hebrew to say, to learn the language of my enemies, he says. Eichmann actually travels incognito uh, to try to meet in Palestine with a Zionist movement in Palestine that wants to set up an underground railway for German Jews to be smuggled out of Germany with Nazi Germany's help into Palestine. But of course, at this point, the British have blocked Jewish immigration into Palestine because of kind of suddenly the disproportionate rapid rise in the Jewish population in Palestine, and now the first kind of Arab Jewish clashes are beginning to occur in Palestine for various complex reasons beyond religion. And so Eichmann actually negotiates with a faction in the Zionist movement, as I say, to organize a secret railroad. But the British, when Eichmann arrives in Cairo on his way to meet with the Zionists, Eichmann is arrested by the British, and he's expelled. So, a lot of Jews could have survived, certainly German Jews could have survived had the British not blocked their kind of refugee path to Israel. So Eichmann, as I say, begins to get his early expertise in Department 4B4, evacuation and Jews. And it is, as I say, Eichmann at this point will testify that there was no plan at this moment to exterminate the Jews. The first plan was to somehow force them out of Germany elsewhere, any place somebody would take them, right through until early 1940, where Eichmann was proposing the so-called Madagascar plan. It was a serious enough plan, although how practical it would have been remains at issue. But the idea was the Germans would have expelled all the Jews to the island of Madagascar, and Madagascar would have become Israel. And of course, what happened was Madagascar was, of course, a colony of France, and in May of 1940, the Germans go to war with France, and the French very quickly basically become turncoats. They surrender and join Nazi Germany, and as a reward, the Nazis allow the French to hold on to their colonies, and Madagascar being one of them. And suddenly, the deportation of the Jews to Madagascar becomes impractical. Nor could the Germans ever figure out how to transport all those Jews in the middle of the war. So, at that point, the final solution starts becoming the only kind of solution that the Nazis see. And of course, Eichmann then ends up with his expertise in, quote, evacuating Jews, now becomes the expert on deporting Jews into the death camps, and becomes this kind of senior figure in the Holocaust. That's why he's chased down by the Israelis in the end, and brought from, I think it was Argentina, that Eichmann is brought to Israel and put on trial. November 9th, 1938, in the midst of this, the son of Jewish Polish refugees in Germany who are forced out of Germany, but Poland won't take them back. Remember, the Poles are as anti-Semitic as the Germans are, and so a lot of Polish Jews who thought they were safer in Germany from Polish anti-Semitism now find themselves being deported from Germany into Poland, but Poland is refusing them admission, end up living in these refugee camps in horrific conditions on the Polish-German border. And so the son of a couple who had managed to make his way somehow to France. Some Jews are still managing to get some kind of temporary refuge in Holland, in France, in Belgium, in Spain, in neighboring countries. They manage under either false identity or they have relatives or some connection. They manage to get some kind of refugee status. The son in Paris decides he's going to shoot in protest the German ambassador. He ends up shooting the German ambassador's deputy or secretary instead. And now Goebbels calls on Germans to show their indignation at this assassination by a Jew of a German diplomat in Paris. And so you get what's known as Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, the Night of Crystal, Kristallnacht, or also the Night of Broken Glass, where Jewish businesses are looted, the windows are smashed. Goebbels, as I say, calls on Germans to show their um, disgust with this. He calls on Hitler Youth, SA stormtroopers to go into the streets. Several hundred Jews are attacked in this program and killed. It's this first really violent event. Partly Goebbels is doing this because he's been losing favor with Adolf Hitler. Goebbels at that moment is having an affair with a German movie star, Magda, his wife, who's very close to Hitler, complains to Hitler. Hitler, remember, the Nazi Party is all about family values, and so Hitler calls Goebbels in on the carpet and says, if you're going to have a mistress, you better do it in secret. I can't have, this is disgusting. You're doing this publicly, dating this movie star. There's all this gossip there. I'm going to expel you from your positions if you don't clean your act up. And so Goebbels hopes that this kind of is a way of gaining Hitler's favor, this kind of action. And so the next day, after all these German businesses are looted and all this glass is broken and fires, said Goebbels comes into a meeting with Goering and Himmler and Hitler, and he thinks he's going to get a pat on the back. But everybody kind of has a really long face. Goering, who's kind of again the plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan, first of all announces that a lot of the Jewish businesses are actually renting the store from German landlords. And of course, the German landlords have insurance on the windows. And the insurance companies now, German insurance companies, have to pay out insurance. Moreover, Germany doesn't have a glass-making industry. The nearest place producing glass is Belgium, and Belgium glass manufacturers don't accept German Reichsmarks for exported goods. They want either US dollars or gold Reichsmarks. And so suddenly German gold reserves to replace the glass are under a heavy debt. Now, Goering suggests that, well, why don't we just pass a law canceling at least those Jewish insurance company policyholders? But the German insurance agency immediately raises red flags, saying you can't do that because we've already subsold our insurance risks to international conglomerates, to Lloyd's of London Insurance Company, to Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. We've kind of sold the risks to mitigate any risk. And if you suddenly cancel those insurance policies, you're going to discredit the entire German insurance industry and will never be able to share risk on international markets. And moreover, a lot of the inventory that the Hitler Youth and the SA looted from those Jewish businesses was products produced by German companies left on consignment in Jewish businesses. And so now the Gestapo has to find all those Hitler Youth that looted the windows and looted the stores and get all that property back to the German companies that was on consignment. So it's a huge disaster. And of course, as Sarah Gordon reports, German public opinion is very, very unhappy with this display of public violence. This is exactly what Hitler does not want and did not want. So Kristallnacht is not only a huge press embarrassment, it's a huge kind of public opinion and political disaster at home. It's a financial disaster. And in fact, what the solution that Goering is going to come up with is he's going to add a atonement tax on Jewish property. So here you go. Here's the taxation figures. Um, the flight tax was 25% on taxable assets, and as well, the atonement tax was an additional 25% on all registered taxable assets. So 50% of your assets would have been taxed if you were Jewish and managed to get out of the country. So the so-called atonement tax is meant to subsidize German insurance industry that has to pay out these payments. So you can now begin to just catch a glimpse of how complex the issues of murdering 6 million people in your population are becoming in terms of business, military conscription, taxation, the census. It's not easy to kill, like I say, a huge portion of your population. 6 million, of course, includes citizens of France and other countries. So let's say 300,000 German Jews, or 5% of the population. That's not bureaucratically, that's going to be a very difficult issue. So once everything takes a violent turn in November 9th, 1938, now Jews inside of Germany now are becoming scared. The Jewish experience with anti-Semitism has been that it comes and goes. And that whatever gets bad eventually begins to ease up. Governments come and go, anti-Semitic leaders come and go, kings and princes come and go. Sometimes things get worse. The worst that can happen is expulsion. But throughout history, there has never been a kind of a concerted murdering of the entire population. And so a lot of Jews feel, well, our descendants have gone through this before, and we'll just live this out. How much worse can it get than the law they just passed yesterday, right? And of course, that's not the case. And now, when it takes this violent turn, now people get scared, and now people really are desperate to get out. Austrian Jews are in particularly sensitive to this because unlike German Jews, um, German Jews kind of it built up over a number of years, but of course, for Austrian Jews, anti Semitic policies all came overnight with the Anschluss. As Austria fell under Nazi Germany, the next day, suddenly all these laws came in force rather than gradually. And so a lot of Austrian Jews really are start running. Now, one place that a lot of both German and Austrian Jews are running to is Switzerland. Switzerland, of course, there is no such thing as a pure Swiss. You're either French, Italian, or German. Those are the three languages spoken in Switzerland. So, essentially, you're Swiss by passport, and so certainly German speakers like from German-speaking countries like Austria and Germany are admitted into Switzerland without a visa, and a lot of Austrian and German Jews are just showing up with their German passport at the Swiss border, crossing over into Switzerland, and just becoming refugees there. Um, the Swiss now come to see Reinhard Heydrich, um, Police Commissioner Emil Heinrich Rothmund of Switzerland comes to Heydrich, who is his kind of equivalent, the head of the German Security Intelligence Police establishment, and he tells Heydrich in June of 1938 that, there are too many Jews getting into Switzerland with the German passport since we don't have a visa. Can you please do something about this because you understand perfectly well why we don't want too many Jews in Switzerland any more than you want them in Germany. And the Heydrich, of course, kind of snickers to himself privately, tells the Swiss, yeah, I'll look into it. And of course, nothing happens. And then, of course, once Kristallnacht occurs, um, you know, suddenly there's a whole wave, a surge of Jewish refugees crossing into Switzerland on their German passport. And now the Swiss come back and now begin to threaten the Nazis, saying that unless you do something about um, Jewish Germans and Austrians going to Switzerland, help us keep them from crossing into Switzerland, we are going to demand that all German passports will require a visa to enter Switzerland. And now the Germans finally do something to make the Swiss happy, to help the Swiss identify Jews appearing on their border. All German passports and identification cards will now be stamped with a big J in the passport. This is the first formal identification of Jews in their documents. Prior to this, the only attempt to identify Jews physically in Germany was on university campuses. In the first year, Jewish students would get a separate Jewish student card. But of course, within a year, when the Nazis passed a law against overcrowding of German schools and Jews are no longer allowed to attend university, that whole thing becomes defunct. As I say, Hitler was against identifying, marking Jews, including in their identification, because he thought that it would bring kind of public attacks on Jews. But here he now reluctantly agrees And then a whole lot of German bureaucrats now think this is a great idea because not only will it make the Swiss happy, but it will make us easier for us to identify Jews. And from this point on, not only Jewish passports, but Jewish driving licenses, identification cards, work books, marriage licenses, any kind of identification will now identify the bearer as being Jewish under those laws that I described. The racial laws. And all those Jews who managed to find refuge in France or in Belgium or in Holland, they of course are there still under their German passport as temporary residents. They're ordered to go to the nearest German embassy and get their German identification updated, or else it'll become invalid, and they'll have to leave the country and return to Germany. And so when they come into the German embassy with their old passport, a big J is now stamped into their passport. And of course, 2 years, 3 years later, when the war is on and the Germans occupy Holland, occupy France, all the German Jews who sought refuge there are very easily quickly rounded up by the Germans as German Jews with a big J stamped in their passport. So this becomes a death warrant for a lot of Jew, and begins, as I say, the identification process that without the Swiss, the Nazis, who knows how long it would have taken them. Certainly they weren't ready to do it yet as late as I say, as 1938. Well, now they're doing it, and we have the Swiss to thank for that. We have the Swiss to thank for a lot of things. There's a reason Switzerland was not invaded by the Germans nor the Allies. The importance of Switzerland, of course, is that both all the enemies could do business with each other in Switzerland, and the Nazis, of course, could shelter Holocaust assets they're seizing from the Jews in Switzerland in Swiss bank accounts using Swiss banking secrecy, and so the Swiss profited enormously from both sides of the war, as American companies as well, which had German subsidiaries, could continue collecting and paying dividends even during the war by hosting their kind of interests in Swiss bank accounts and in Swiss offshore corporations, essentially. So, the Swiss share in this evil is again, would have been a whole lecture by itself had I had more lectures to be able to give you. So, by 1939, half of Germany's Jewish population had left, about 150,000 Jews. So when Hitler comes to power, there are 300,000 Jews in in Germany. By 1939, half have left Germany, 150,000. The problem, of course, is that there are many more Jews in Austria. And so the moment Hitler invades Austria, suddenly the number of Jews in kind of Grosse Deutschland, in the new Third Reich, incorporating Austria, jumps back to the 300,000 starting point. That's not going to, of course, be of very encouraging for Nazi anti-Semitic policies. There's a huge change as well in the demographics of the Jewish population. Um, Most of the 150,000 Jews that get out of Germany are single young men, the ones who are best equipped to survive what is going to happen. They also happen to be the ones who are most willing to risk and just leave everything behind. So the percentage of Jews over the age of 45 in Germany rises from 47% in 1933 to 73.7% by 1939. Women, the percentage of Jews who are women rises from 52 to 57% by 1939. So the younger Jews leave, males predominantly leave, and leave behind those who are least adept at surviving. The aged, the poor, women, children, elderly, and so forth, the least suited for survival. So that's kind of radical transformation. Um, you also have to remember that when the Sudetenland, another, I think, 30,000 Jews from the Sudetenland. So once Hitler goes, takes that part of Czechoslovakia, the number of Jews, in fact, there'll be 30,000 more Jews in Grosse Deutschland, in the Third Reich, than when Hitler began, when there were 300,000 when Hitler began. And of course, just over the border, in Poland, there's 10 times. There's nearly 3 million Jews in Poland compared to 300,000 in Germany. So once Germany conquers Poland, you can see what German anti-Semites are facing in terms of the amount of Jewish population. We're talking now of 3.3 million Jews eventually coming under Third Reich administration, and so that is always, and nobody is letting, they're not going to let 300,000 Jews escape Germany anywhere. All the other countries around the world, forget if they're going to let 3 million Polish Jews as refugees. So we can begin to see how the final solution of that decision is now getting shaped primarily by their no place to go, either other than standing down on anti-Semitic ideology and policy, or going kind of the Trump route, doing nothing. Trump makes a lot of promises, but eventually, but does very little. Hitler, of course, certainly is, what makes him scarier than Trump is whatever Hitler says he does, he actually goes ahead and tries to do it in a real way. And so the Nazis, if they're going to fulfill the promise of making Germany Judenfrei, or free of the Jews, the only solution that is going to be left for them eventually will be to kill them all, the final solution. And so that's how the Nazis are being edged towards that fatal period, somewhere, as I say, between August and October of 1941. In those 3 months, August, September, October, there is a kind of genocidal consensus that begins to emerge that the final solution is going to be to kill them all. But you can see how long it's going to take. So long before the Nazis as a kind of racist, racialist exigency, um, begin killing the Jews of Europe, um, long before they kill um, nearly 3 million Poles as well as part of that policy. In fact, the Germans will be killing the Poles long before they start killing the Jews. They'll start killing the Poles in 39. And before the Germans start killing the Poles, they're going to start killing their own German babies that don't fit the perfect racial model. And there is a kind of a scientific or pseudoscientific notion that not only Nazi Germany but many countries around the world are practicing this idea of racial hygiene or eugenics. Racial hygiene is a branch of an acceptable science. There's even racial hygiene journals. Here you can see how they kind of eventually changed the term from racial hygiene to eugenics, trying to make it sound a little bit more scientific. It comes out of agriculture, agricultural practices, the idea that through selective breeding you can improve, say, a breed of cow that produces more milk, or a species of wheat that is more productive, and so forth and so forth. Why not people? Why can't we selectively breed people to make a more intelligent, a better person, rather than allowing morons to interbreed? That would be the argument of eugenicists in all sorts of countries. And so there are eugenics faculties, there are professors of eugenics, is studied at universities and so forth. There are eugenics societies. Here you're looking at a German eugenics propaganda poster that kind of shows this Prussian era officer who marries well on the left, and he produces this family of healthy, middle class, sober, church going descendants. But on the side, he has this drunken mistress. And with her, he produces a line of cretins, essentially. Let's see if I can give you a closer look at that poster. So, healthy descendants, healthy partner, healthy wife produces healthy children. A drunken or mentally incapacitated mistress produces criminals and mental defectives and diseased alcoholic followers. There's a Russian school of eugenics, kind of social eugenics. Here you can see infants. Another concept like this is kind of positive eugenics, where the environment counts. So you can see these infants are making demands. We demand, breast milk. We demand clean air, clean water, and so forth. A good environment that brings up healthy children. So you have kind of the positive eugenics movement as well. In the United States, of course, you also have powerful eugenics movements as well. The Eugenics Society, American Eugenics Society, and again, you can see this display from the 1920s. Every 48 seconds, a person is born in the United States who will never grow up mentally beyond that stage of a normal 8-year-old. Um, this light flashes every 50 seconds. Person committed to jail. Very few normal persons ever go to jail. um, and so forth. So again, selective breeding. And so the first thing that the Nazis introduce um, is the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring. July 14th, 1933. It takes effect January of 1934. This law is intended to mandate compulsory sterilization for people deemed to have a hereditary disease. And there's a whole list of hereditary diseases, including things like epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, various hereditary disorders. The law itself is modeled on American law. In fact, the United States has been practicing sterilization for most of the 20th century. Here you can see a textbook published in 1929 reporting on 6,000 sterilizations for the betterment of human beings that were perpetrated in California between 1909 and 1929. In fact, when the Nazis introduced this sterilization law, the New York Times comments that it's already legal, the kind of law that the Nazis want to introduce in 27 states of the United States. In Canada, we sterilized between 1929 and 1965 thousands of people, mostly Aboriginal peoples. There are a number of lawsuits. There were some 700 people attached to a class action lawsuit in Alberta, where most of these sterilizations took place. The way the sterilizations were done was kids often were called to do a quote an IQ test at school, and those that didn't do well on the IQ test were sent to see the nurse and were sterilized unknown to their parents or to them. And of course, you have the Leilani Moore case in the 1990s, 1996. Leilani Moore, a Aboriginal woman, was awarded $740,000 for being secretly sterilized in one of those IQ tests at school. She didn't know about it until she went to see a doctor when she was unable to conceive. She went to see a fertility expert, and he tells her, yeah, of course you can't conceive. Somebody surgically sterilized you when you were a little girl. And so we discovered that between 1929 and 1972, I repeat, 1972, Alberta sterilized 2,832 people under kind of the guidance of John M. McEachran, the founder of the Department of Philosophy and Psychology at the University of Alberta and the chairman of the Eugenics Board of Alberta from 1929 to 1965. So a lot of those cases were still pending to be settled. There's something like $142 million of sterilization lawsuits in Canada. So there's a little bit of a Nazi in everybody, maybe a little bit more in Alberta than perhaps other parts of Canada. Sweden acknowledged that it sterilized more than 60,000 people between 1935 and 1975. So this practice, even in the 1970s. So again, the Nazis were not the first to come up with it. And in fact, in this case, the Nazis have kind of adopted it from our own Western democratic nation practices. So, as I say, there could be a law in Nazis for, a bit of a Nazi in everybody. Essentially, there would be kind of sterilization courts with physicians as judges, judging who gets to be sterilized. Um, the Nazis at first wanted to sterilize 1.2 million Germans, but after some discussion, the number was reduced to 400,000, and they sterilized approximately 300,000 Germans by 1939. Until they then decided, rather than sterilizing them, the next phase was just, we're going to kill them. And of course, that is going to lead us into Operation T4. So there is this kind of ideological drive in Germany um, to sterilize the German population of monsters, as they would be referred to. And here you can see, if the birth rate continues at this rate, and we continue housing the handicapped, and we allow the handicapped or the disabled to have children, in 120 years, we will be completely surrounded by monsters and freaks and defectives. As this German poster says here, 60,000 Reichsmarks spent on keeping this individual alive. And this becomes an issue for Germans during the First World War. As Germany is blockaded, and indeed many patients in the hospitals begin to starve, and some German doctors and scientists begin to argue that German war wounded can't get a hospital bed because we're supporting all these handicapped people who will never become functioning members of society. Perhaps they should be put out of their misery for the benefit of society. And so, two theorists, a legal scholar, Carl Binding, and psychiatrist Albert Hoche, now publish a book called The Authorization of the Destruction of Life, Unworthy of Life. And in it, they write, quote, if one imagines a battlefield covered with thousands of dead youths, and then our institutes for idiots and their care, and idiots the way it's translated in those terms is a technical term for what we would now also it's a kind of a defunct term, retarded. We don't use that term anymore, but mentally disabled, whatever politically correct term is this week as I lecture. Idiots used to be the term. So when you read that in kind of old literature, that's what it's referring to. If one imagines a battlefield covered with thousands of dead youths and then our institutes for idiots and their care, one is most appalled by the sacrifice of the best of humanity while the highest care is lavished on life of negative worth. So the term life unworthy of life becomes this term. And so it's going to be triggered by that one event that I had described to you in the KDF, in the Chancellor of the Fuhrer. Remember Philip Bohler, who looks at petitions. He gets a petition from the parents of a malformed infant who ask Hitler to give their physician permission to euthanize their child. Hitler instructs his Surgeon General at that time, Dr. Karl Brandt, to go see the child and see if this is true, if indeed the child is beyond being healed or can be reintroduced in society in some way. And Dr. Brandt comes back and confirms that indeed this child is ill, and not only that, but the child parents indeed want the child to be euthanized. They feel that that's the best thing for their child, and now Hitler gives the order that the doctor may euthanize the child, and that if there's any problems, if the police come and accuse him of murder for having euthanized the child, the doctor can rely on Hitler's Führer order giving him the authority to do that. And now he tells Brandt, organize, let's kill all the other children as well. But let's not just tell the parents. The parents don't need to know. And so Brandt is now, and Bowler, the two of them, are now given this directive. It's a very short order. It's a written order that's given to this doctor. The written order is issued October of 1939, and of course the war began September 1st, 39. So it's, as Germany is suddenly now going into a war state, Hitler gives this written order, and the written order reads very simple. It says, Reichsleiter Bohler and Dr. Brandt, MD, are given the responsibility of enlarging the authority of certain physicians to be designated by name in such a manner that persons who, according to human judgment, are incurable can be, upon the most careful diagnosis of their condition of sickness, be accorded a mercy death. And he backdates this written order September 1st to the first day of the war. It's unclear why he dates that, but most historians speculate that even though the order is issued October, that it's dated September 1st to kind of make it seem as a war time designation. The organization that is going to pick certain specific doctors and hire them for this killing program, and it will give them the authority to issue an order to euthanize. And again, every time I say the word euthanize, see quotation marks around it, because euthanasia, death with dignity, is a kind of, defines a merciful death. What the Nazis are going to be doing is nothing but medical murder, period, but it will be referred to as euthanasia. Doctors will be handpicked by Bowler and Brandt. They will be given a special authority to issue a medical certificate requiring that a particular patient be put to death. And I'll describe that process to you. Obviously, I'm running out of time, so I'll describe that process to you. They will do this under an assumed name. So the signature will, each doctor will get an assumed name attached to them. So many of these doctors won't be exposed until the 1950s and 1960s. Some of them will survive the war. They will be headquartered in Tiergarten 4, which is where the Reich, Tiergartenstrasse 4, where the Reich's chancellery is based. That's the address. Tiergarten is the kind of name of the street. Strasse means street. 4 is the address. So Tiergartenstrasse 4, and the code name for the operation becomes known as Operation T4, therefore. And so T4 will be a program to identify all handicapped children and eventually adults in German hospitals, sanitariums, orphanages, and so forth that will fall under a category to be murdered, and the program will now systematically proceed to murder them. So I'll carry on how these doctors are recruited and how the systems work in next lecture.